So I did want to ask you quickly before we kind of wrap back around and close things out by discussing the Week 17 opponent for the Titans. In terms of the schedule element here, the Indianapolis Colts face the Titans in Week 16, a team we've been talking about, the Giants in Week 17, a team we've been talking about. Any changes at all to your thought process on Jonathan Taylor as someone who, if you're going to play a Will Levis or a Daniel Jones late, if we're wrong on them, do you want the Colts running back to score, say, those 3 first half touchdowns and fuel the comeback attempt from the Titans or the Giants? In terms of, and we've talked about the Colts a little bit more and a little bit more recently, but Jonathan Taylor at the 203, Michael Pittman at the 310, and then these receivers of Josh Downs at the 11-11, not too long after Adonai Mitchell late in round 10. I mean, there are interesting ways to play this Colts offense since we don't really have a great feel for what Anthony Richardson is going to do for us this year.
So I feel like we were more pessimistic about playing the Titans and more optimistic about playing the Giants. So I'm wondering your question about if there's any change on how to play the Colts. I guess my response would be,
are you going to have some teams that would be like Colts, Titans, Giants, and you have that cluster?
Probably not Titans. I think my response would be that I would not really be as tightly wound to stacking up week 16 on the Colts teams, because I don't, unless I get Tyjae Spears or what have you, but I don't think our conversation today has really made me feel like I need to go out and get more exposure to the Titans. Because the biggest thing is I still don't know that I buy that Will Levis is any good, right? And there's nothing else there that's glaring that if he's good, this is definitely going to hit. Because even if he is decent, and that's probably the ceiling, the running backs might still cannibalize. The receiving stuff might still cannibalize to a certain degree. It's not really clear. I have to get multiple things right. So I don't like betting into the Titans. I do like playing the Giants. I think the Wan'Dale Robinson point was great. I have a lot of Malik Neighbors already. And now we're talking about maybe Singletary being a play worth making. And so, yeah, I mean, and I think A.D. Mitchell makes sense in his range as a guy who's not going inside the wide receiver window, but could provide you some rookie ceiling, a swing worth making. JT makes sense. I think the New York Giants week 17 is a fun thing to do.
You know that I'm skeptical about Anthony Richardson specifically as a passer. I have a really hard time with Mitchell being currently behind, Josh Palmer. I'm going to rank it. I probably can't do that.
He's behind Dobbs, Khalil Shakir, and Rashid Shaheed.
Johnston in at the top of my Chargers list. That's not going to fly. But yeah,
Quinton Johnston ahead of not just Palmer but also McConkey.
Why not? I mean, you gotta go for it, right? Every time that I Google Quinton Johnston, the GM says he's ready to launch in 2024. That's one quote that obviously does come out at the top of all of his search results. So
I feel like I'm pretty good about having the short-term memory. It's one of the reasons I don't love Dynasty and I like redraft. Like we've done this with Pitts every year, and I've made the case every year that he is a good play again the next year. And even with some of the players that I like to be on every year, I've been willing to come off of them when I thought the play wasn't right. Obviously, famously last year, I wasn't really in on A.J. Brown and DJ Moore. That was smart because that was the year that they both went off. But Quinton Johnston's the one, Sean, that he was on too many of my teams. He hurt me too much last year. I don't know how I'm going to get on him. The price is right. And there's spots where I look at it and I'm like, if he has any upside, like this would help this build to have Quinton Johnston at pick 150 here. I I don't know if I could do it. I don't know if I could take a clear-headed look at it and say that he actually has upside.
Well, obviously, Harbaugh and company are extreme competitors. They're not going to sit back and be like, oh, we're pointing at 2025, 2026, whenever. And so if there's a massive gap between Palmer and Chark and, say, Quinton Johnston, then those guys are going to play and those guys are going to score some points. I do think that they still have a little bit more of the long view in mind. And it's humorous to, listen to some of the things where, Johnston's talking about putting too much pressure on himself, dropping some of those passes. The Chargers think he wasn't used properly, but you've got to get him involved on some underneath stuff as well. They think they've already fixed his release off the line of scrimmage. Again, and these are summer storylines. You have to look at the actual production. But I would go back and point out that his production in college is better than people think that it was now that he was so awful as a rookie. Mitchell, I think.
I just tried to sell the listeners on Traylon Burks like a half an hour ago, so we might as well.
Might as well. Quinton Johnston going one spot ahead of Darnell Mooney. That one a little bit humorous. He's going a couple spots after Ricky Pearsall, who is probably going to have a 10% snap rate this year. People don't like Quinton Johnston. But Adonai Mitchell, you get a couple of those deep shots. I think that Mitchell, I'm a little bit, Ben, I don't like fantasy football being boiled down to the idea that we're now just drafting players because they might score a 60-yard touchdown in week 17. But I do believe that Adonai Mitchell and Devontae Walker are going to get over the top of defenses this year and score some points that matter, right? Are they going to be easy for you to start on your FFPC main event team? Probably not. I don't understand their prices right now in these tournaments. And I do think that the Colts are, the Mitchell specifically, but also Jonathan Taylor. If you're going to take a running back early, it is actually kind of fun to play Colts, Giants. And so then I think the question becomes Jaguars, Titans. For me, one of the reasons why I don't have many players from these teams is that I'm skeptical about both sides of that game. And once you become skeptical of both sides, then you end up knocking down your rankings even a little bit, just sort of mentally, fading those guys even from where you have them. And so that makes it tough for me to like Christian Kirk at wide receiver 30, even though he's been a very solid play throughout his Jaguars tenure. I guess I'm getting a little more fired up about Brian Thomas. Now, what I should say about this is that after we had our Geno Smith discussion last week, and we were trying to figure out how can the Seahawks create enough volume to make DK Metcalf, JSN, and Tyler Lockett all work. How do we get those points for Lockett? Is he a decent value at wide receiver 51? I went to the RotoViz screener and I pulled up all of the seasons where three receivers on the same team, that could include the tight end, and it usually did include the tight end. All of the seasons where a franchise managed to do that. And it comes out being about 14% of the overall individual team seasons this century. But one of the coordinators who comes up consistently as having done this a lot in the recent past is Doug Peterson, both with the Eagles and with the Jaguars. And the Jaguars last couple of seasons, they have this dynamic where I think the individual players were disappointing, but in 2023, you get Ingram and Ridley both above 200, with Christian Kirk at 154 because he misses some games. And then in 2022, you have Kirk at 220, Zay Jones at 191, and Ingram at 168. This isn't necessarily something where you're saying, oh, well, if they're doing that, then I'm in on these guys. One of the things we're looking at is how do you get the really big season? And that'll be a part of the article that I eventually put out on this topic. But I was wondering if you feel, and one of the things that we have with the Jaguars is you are going to have that fourth receiver involved as well, Gabe Davis. And I mentioned that I was a little bit skeptical of him, but you're going to have this offense with Trevor Lawrence, who has both struggled and yet was the signal caller, was the passer for these last two offenses where you had three guys score 150 or above. Does the addition of a more dynamic fourth player create volume concerns for all three of these guys? Is it more likely that we have an injury that eliminates the traffic jam? Is it more likely that we simply see the players separate based on either talent or role? One of the things that you've mentioned a lot is that you do like Kirk and that you do think that his role is maybe going to be less affected than Thomas or Davis, who would seem to have a lot of overlap in terms of how the Jaguars would get them the ball. But again, I mean, last year, Calvin Ridley, as the deep threat, the second most routes in the entire NFL.
Yeah, no, it's a tricky one. And it's one that I have tried to think through more dynamically lately because my initial thought was very much like, okay, they've added deep threats and it's going to create this underneath opportunity for Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram to just soak up volume while Brian Thomas and Gabe Davis especially are running off a lot of the deep routes. You've said some favorable things about Brian Thomas. One of the things that's made me think is, what if I'm like completely missing the boat here and it's Gabe Davis who's typecast in the deep threat role, which he probably should be. And Brian Thomas is, running deep routes, but also able to do some stuff underneath because Gabe Davis is the one. I mean, you don't have to have two go routes on every play, right? Like Gabe Davis is more traditionally the deep threat. And it frees up Brian Thomas to do stuff at all depths. What if that is, maybe I'm thinking through that. Maybe he's more traditional number one in that regard. The other part of this that I think is really interesting, and you said you haven't played a lot of Jacksonville, but the part of it that I'm into is I think Trevor Lawrence is a pretty solid quarterback pick. He goes about pick 120. He's going right ahead of Tua, and Tua's a good pick in his own right. We've always liked Tua's price. We liked him a lot last year, and there's, when I say always, just the last couple of years, people are sort of fading the concussion history and some of those risks. And now this year it's that they want to fade the week 17 matchup in Cleveland. They're very confident that Tua is not going to be able to play on the road in the cold in week 17. Tough bet to be making in June, but that's 6 months from now. We'll see how those weather reports worked out. But that is a range of quarterbacks that, Shawn, in years past, you've written about as sort of the QB window, and in best ball can be really advantageous to hit a couple names in that range. Lawrence provides a little bit of mobility, hasn't been a huge fantasy hit yet. There's a lot of people that talk about him as, he's probably now just more limited ceiling overall player. I guess I think there's still some potential for Lawrence to be a star at some point, because year one was with Urban Meyer. Year two, he showed so much growth. Year three is a little bit of the post-growth lull that we see with young players, but he came in young. He's a few years into his career now, and yet we see with so many quarterbacks that it takes time sometimes. It's such a mental position. You have to learn all of the coverages you're going to see, all of the things the teams are going to throw at you, and answers for all of them, and you start to accumulate that, and the physical goes with the mental. There's a lot of QBs that didn't break out until they were 30, right? A lot of QBs that had their best seasons later in their career. Trevor Lawrence hasn't been great early in his career. He's had some issues. I did see a montage on Twitter. I think it was probably Ian Hartitz who does a lot of these types of things. If it wasn't, apologies to whoever made it. But it was like Trevor Lawrence, good throws that were dropped and that type of thing last year. And a bunch of them were Calvin Ridley. But he made a lot of good aggressive throws that guys didn't make plays on for him last year. He pushes the ball down the field. He'll take chances. He's thrown a few too many picks early in his career as a result of that. He always seems to throw a backbreaking one in the red zone. But what if he gets the interceptions in check, right? What if I was talking about this on a stream over on my YouTube recently, and I said it took Brett Favre until that year with the Vikings at the end of his career to kind of get the interceptions and the gunslinger stuff in check. And it was at the very end of his career. He had, statistically, I think, one of the best seasons of his career. And then, interestingly enough, ended up throwing an interception that cost him the NFC Championship, at the end of that season. So the gunslinger mentality still came back out. But I think there's some potential for Lawrence to still take this step forward now in year 3 with Doug Peterson. I think they have a better receiving core for what his strengths are. And if Brian Thomas is a hit, especially Sean, I think Christian Kirk is a good player alongside that. I think Evan Ingram, he's built some rapport with Evan Ingram as well. Gabe Davis, I think, is an efficient player when the targets get there. I think he's a little misunderstood, but you go look at, I mean, yeah, his targets per out run rate have been falling off, but defenses are taking away Gabe Davis from the Buffalo Bills offense. I mean, not Gabe Davis specifically, but they're taking away the explosives. That's the thing we know. They're taking away the vertical thing, pass attempts. But as soon as the target has been won and thrown towards Gabe Davis, he's still been efficient per target on that side of the ledger. It's just the lack of target volume. If you go look at, say, his yards per out run over the last few years starting to trail off, it's all on the targets per out run side. It's not on the yards per target. It's not, he's still been able to score touchdowns. The point being, he can win on deep. I think Gabe Davis is a skilled deep receiver. He tracks the ball well and he makes plays. He uses his body well. He wins at the catch point. Maybe some of that is that he just was able to get so open at times with the Bills, and maybe that won't dramatically translate to the Jags. My point is, I think he can provide some efficiency boost to Lawrence on some of these deep throws that other guys weren't bringing in down the field, that Brian Thomas should provide some efficiency on some of those deep throws. I think those guys are going to have splash potential, spike week potential. I'm starting to come around, like I said, a little bit on the Brian Thomas thing, especially because his price has gotten more palatable. I've actually drafted him now in the 70s. He was going in the 60s in the pre-draft range. It's surprising to me, I guess, that he's dropped 10 picks despite going in the first round and getting the draft capital that people were kind of weighing pre-draft already into his equation. Like that, we got those boxes checked, and now he's cheaper. He's outside the elite tight end range. It's just tricky because he goes right before JSN and Rashee Rice and Deontay Johnson, and that's a trio that a lot of times I'm just pushing up and taking over Brian Thomas, but I can definitely understand taking some Thomas. I've been taking a decent amount of Kirk in large part, again, because of the other guys around him. He goes right after George Pickens and Amari Cooper, who I'm not taking a lot of. And so then I end up taking Kirk more because it's like, if I need a receiver in this build, because I took an early running back, I push Kirk into the 4th round sometimes, or at that 4 or 5 turn when he starts to slide in the 5th round, he's a nice pick. But I don't think I would even rank him like that. Like I would rank Xavier Worthy over him, but I can get Xavier Worthy at the 5-6 turn sometimes, and I'm still really exposed to Xavier Worthy at this point. I was telling you before the stream that, we had a draft early this offseason. I really wanted to take Rashee Rice over Xavier Worthy. You had to kind of talk me into it. I've come full circle on that pretty quickly, and taking plenty of Worthy, especially with Rice's price and the concern over Rice. I mean, you just have to be really excited about what Xavier Worthy could do right out of the gate as the first round wide receiver that the Chiefs traded up for. So anyway, I mean, it's some of it is just the pockets that these players go in, but I do like the Jaguars passing game. I haven't taken any Ingram. That's another one where I like him almost as much as I like Kirk as this underneath play and potential volume play and all those things, but he's really expensive right behind George Kittle. And I don't think he's an elite tight end. I don't think he can contend for the George Kittle type season. The Kittle upside case is some of it's contingency based. Like, what if Debo misses time? Like, Kittle's going to be a huge part of their pass game at that point. And that's, you mentioned the Pearsall thing. Even if Pearsall plays, it's probably the other, like if Debo or Ayuk gets hurt or something, it's probably the other 3 studs that are getting most of the volume. And Pearsall's the Juwan Jennings type at that point, getting a little bit of work, 10 to 15% target share, but nothing that's really that exciting. So anyway, I don't end up with a lot of Ingram because I do think Kittle is just a meaningfully better profile, and it's too expensive for the drop off. I don't end up with a ton of Brian Thomas. I haven't drafted much Gabe Davis either, but I do want to draft Lawrence. And I do think that this is an offense that could rebound and be somewhat interesting from that perspective with where he goes, and that the Jaguars passing game could be an underrated stack to be in on. Now, the playoff weeks are a little bit tricky because the matchups don't really project as shootouts, but at least the weather's pretty decent. It's the Jets and then at Vegas and then Tennessee. Jets and Tennessee are both home games. So you get 2 South Florida games and 1 in Vegas. But obviously the Jets, Vegas, Tennessee, not like a shootout list of high scoring opposition, especially that Tennessee game in week 17. But if Lawrence can take that step forward that I sort of implied, and he has that profile, that willingness to push downfield, that mobility, and now better receivers and receivers that can maybe help his efficiency and turn more plays into actual, completions on these aggressive throws that he makes into tight windows. Then I think, I'm going to wish I probably had more Jacksonville. But no, this conversation, I'm still trying to piece together how I want to play the receivers. This conversation does have me questioning why I'm drafting more Kirk than any of them, and he's the most expensive. And yet I am wondering about how neatly everything's going to fit together as I originally thought. I originally thought, okay, well, you have these deep threats, Gabe Davis and Brian Thomas, that are going to make it easy for the underneath guys. And now that's probably being too precise. And so I'm just trying to consider the other opportunities, the other potential here, including that Brian Thomas does a lot more than I expect.
I love the way that you broke that down there. And the notes that you have on Trevor Lawrence, I think, will make me go back and really force myself to think through if I can, what I really think of him. Because he was not a dynamic player last year from a fantasy perspective. And watching the games, I was very unimpressed. And sometimes that can be a little bit misleading, especially if he's not getting the play that he needs from someone like a Calvin Ridley. And if I'm blaming some of these issues on Ridley and saying that's one of the reasons why I don't think that you should be drafting him at his range, then, it can be on both of the guys. It doesn't have to be one or the other. But if Ridley is part of the problem, then, and I think the coaching was awful, right? And so I do think that they have to make some changes and might. And so when we think about, well, what could we be wrong about? If they do a lot of things somewhat similarly, but fix a few of the problems in addition to upgrading the personnel, then suddenly you could be in a completely different world. I don't tend to look, quite as much at EP when it comes to QBs as some of their positions, but it is interesting when you work through it. You look at the passing EP, the rushing EP. Lawrence has been in this range at just about 20 points the last couple of years, which certainly is a good floor to think of, like, what would happen if some of this stuff works a little bit better. And when I was splitting out a second ago here on SIS, looking at passing attempts of 15 plus yards, I believe that Lawrence was 9th in attempts and was also like 10th or 11th in points earned per attempt. So that's, in that top third group in both volume and efficiency when we're thinking about a type of throw that the offense is going to be predicated upon, but also a type of throw that's very useful for fantasy. I guess for me, the thing that over the last week and then hypercharged by this conversation is that I'm going to have to get some Brian Thomas. When I look at Christian Kirk, I'm thinking to myself, I probably am not giving him enough credit. I probably need to update my ranking. It's almost certainly too low, just in the same way that, we mentioned these broken ADPs. You don't want to have broken rankings out there. But even once I move it, I don't think that I'm going to be able to get him because he's going right in between Trey McBride and Dalton Kincaid, two players I'm trying to get massive amounts of. And I can't imagine myself ever being on the clock, even knowing that you want to balance your exposure a little bit. I can't imagine a scenario where I'm ever on the clock thinking, I would prefer to have him over McBride or Kincaid. But when I'm looking at the receiver position, and obviously in actual drafts, you're not going to be able to get it exactly this way, but ADP sets up nicely to get DeAndre Hopkins and Brian Thomas together. And certainly there are going to be drafts in which you can get them together and then you can get Trevor Lawrence. So one of the reasons I haven't been playing these guys is I don't like playing them together. And yet I'm now thinking that I should be a little bit more on DeAndre Hopkins. I think I should be a lot more on Brian Thomas. The real roadblock for taking Brian Thomas is that he comes right in between Jordan Addison and Jackson Smith and Jigba, which, anybody who's read my priority targets piece knows I do like those guys. I think they're both significantly undervalued. But I don't think that you have to get so much of Addison, especially with JJ McCarthy as the QB, and you don't have to get so much of JSN, who could be the number 3 receiver in a dysfunctional offense with Geno Smith. You don't have to get so much of those guys that you take Hopkins and Brian Thomas off the table. And while, I mean, Brian Thomas is clearly not the same level of prospect as a Marvin Harrison or a Malik Neighbors, you also just have a lot more room to work with him because he's not going like, I mean, Marvin Harrison, it just boggles me every time I see like the 201. And I have a few shares there because he could end up being, the next Jamar Chase or Justin Jefferson. But the prices on those two guys mean that you need them to be really good right away. If Brian Thomas is sort of and it's not going to like come out of nowhere, but you think about some of the players who were picked in the late first into the mid second last year that absolutely dominated. I guess I think that Brian Thomas is set up to potentially do that, especially because the early reviews from him on their, handful of practices have been enthusiastic. Now, again, that's mostly just summer puff piece stuff, but you certainly strongly prefer that over someone not making any noise, right? So I guess I have some enthusiasm in terms of trying to go out and do some drafts if I ever get, but I haven't gotten the 101 yet. So I don't know what I would do if I got that. That's kind of the pick. That's kind of the first time I get the 101, am I going to be like, oh, this is the draft to take DeAndre Hopkins at Brian Thomas? It probably won't be. I'll be like, how can I try and get both Jordan Addison and JSN onto the team? But I like that pairing of those two players, especially with, the way that you've discussed Trevor Lawrence, that I think is right. If you got a breakout this season from Trevor Lawrence, it
wouldn't be that surprising.
Yeah, and looking up the drop numbers, as you mentioned, I mean, Ridley dropped 8 passes last year. The other guys dropped like 5 each. I mean, ETN dropped 5 passes.
And some of them were really nice passes when I referenced that that cut up. I mean, a lot of those cut ups are sometimes they're just kind of silly. You watch the highlights and you're like, okay, this isn't really that exciting. But the Lawrence one was like, man, he threw some really nice balls that guys just couldn't get their feet in bounds or whatever. But I had the same perception as you from watching the games last year that he was just not impressive and the coaching wasn't good enough. It wasn't interesting enough. I know I wrote negatively about it all year in Stealing Signals. Like, this is just not good enough, guys. Like you guys were coming off a good season in 2022 and took such a step back in 2023. Whatever you're trying to do, incorporating Calvin Ridley is the wrong thing. It's just not working. And yet seeing that video, I was like, man, I mean, there was some stuff here that, maybe I didn't internalize it enough throughout the season, but there's a lot of those balls that were good throws. They're good aggressive throws. Lawrence makes aggressive throws. I think sometimes we judge him on a little bit of a higher bar because he was the 101 and it's like, he should be better than this. And he makes some dumb interceptions. I mean, he's made some bad throws, like outright terrible picks that he's thrown throughout his, first several seasons. But that's like young quarterback stuff. He played it at age 22 in his rookie season. He's just playing at age 24 last year. Like, it's not, he would definitely not be the first quarterback in NFL history to struggle until they were an age 25 quarterback and then start to mature enough to handle some of those situations, some of those extended plays, some of those extra looks that they're looking at. And for a lot of quarterbacks, when it clicks. And then they have answers to everything you're throwing at them, and they're not getting themselves into the in-play panic, right? It all starts to slow down or however, we use all these cliches, but I'm not saying it's going to happen for Lawrence, but he does enough right. Because I agree with you. The overall package last year wasn't good enough. 21 TDs, 14 picks, barely threw for 4,000 yards. But he does enough right that you could see it all clicking at some point. I don't know if that'll be 2024. I don't know if it'll be ever. But I think we've written it off too much as a fantasy community. I think it's a possibility. The other big note that I want to counter with, or not counter, but you're getting really excited about Brian Thomas. I at least for me, certainly will be different than you on this, but I'm coming at it. I want to clarify for the listeners from the position of where I was previously like, I'm probably going to be a full fade on Brian Thomas, where now I'm at least drafting some of him. I do think he's worth picking at times. I have pretty big concerns about a guy who never put up a 20% targets per out run at the college level in an offense that I do expect to be pretty multiple and have a lot of pieces involved. I do still think there will be deep shots for Gabe Davis. I do still think Christian Kirk and Evan Ingram are going to, even if Thomas is doing stuff at all depths like I was talking about, I think Kirk and Ingram are going to get plenty of targets, right? They maybe won't get as many as their ADP suggests, but they're not going to be like sub 80 targets. They're both going to be in the 80 to 100 range unless they miss some time. But that's a good chunk of the overall pass volume. Gabe Davis maybe only gets like 70 targets or something, but that's another big chunk of the pass volume. I don't want to be too projections focused because if Brian Thomas is a smash right away, he's a smash right away. But one of the things that we're doing with these rookies and pushing them up so high in the community is understating that rookies don't get a ton of volume right away in year one. They have to be efficiency wins. Thomas can be that. But like you mentioned the Harrison thing, and I've made this point, I've used this stat before, but Jamar Chase and Justin Jefferson, the two massive hits as rookies, both averaged at least 2.0 targets per game more in year two. They became who they are more in year two than in year one because teams don't just have rookies that they immediately make the focal point of their passing game. They have to prove themselves a little bit. It's tough for me with Thomas that he didn't earn volume in a big way in college to envision that he's a monster unless it's all efficiency. That's the part of it where I'm like, I want to have some because I think he could be an efficiency win. He was so efficient last year in college.
Ben, what I'm hearing there is keep vacuuming up Jackson Smith and Jigba. This has been
right
a really fun conversation. Well, let us know if you're concerned that you're not thinking about Tennessee and Jacksonville correctly, if you'll be doing anything differently in your drafts in the near future. And for everyone listening to the full audio, thanks for staying with us through the show here. As always, I'm Shawn Siegele. With me is Ben Gretch, whom you can follow at Yards Per Gretch, at Stealing Signals, at Stealing Lines. And again, thank you to everybody who has joined him for his early shows and subscribed to Stealing Signals YouTube. That's absolutely fantastic. We would love to have you guys over at RotoViz. The coupon code there is RVRadio 2024 at checkout for a 10% discount on your 1-year subscription. Love to have you join me and Colin on Overtime. Subscribe to the various shows. Leave us those ratings and reviews. We get notes sometimes saying that you have. Appreciate that so much. We love you guys. We'll talk to you soon.